Hello, I'm Chris Flisher, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion on astrology, art, and adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore the current planetary alignments and offer insights for coping with change. Educational, informative, enlightening, the Turning of the Wheel is a welcome pause in your daily swirl of constant change. Through intelligent discourse, inspired guests, and educational segments, I will help to enlighten your knowledge of astrology and guide you to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Call in with your questions and speak with some of the greatest visionaries in the time-tested practice of astrology. Turning of the Wheel, Astrology, Art, and Adventure with Chris Flisher, each week on Turning of the Wheel podcast. Hello and welcome to Turning of the Wheel. As you know, this is a show about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure. And the spiritual adventure umbrella of my sort of tagline allows me to stray into different areas that are not associated with astrology and art. And those of you who have been on my show many times in the past and are devoted listeners, I am very thankful to you. But I'd like you to know that I also do stray into things. But I think these topics that I talk about are all related to a single sense of purpose, which is really about expanding our awareness of ourselves and how do we move on with the world in especially fractious times that we're currently inhabiting. Before I start our guest, I want to remind you about my newsletter, which goes out every Sunday afternoon. In there, you'll find some mundane astrology, which applies to all of us, and then I break it out into individual signs, and you can always find out stuff from there. If you want a personal reading from me, contact me at chris@chrisflisher.com. My websites are chrisflisher.com, turningofthewheel.com, and turningofthewheel.tv. So I'm really kind of all out there. But anyway, that's nothing new to any of you who listen to me. So without further ado, my guest today is a man named Danny Penman, and he's just written a book called The Art of Breathing, which sounds kind of unusual to some of you, but it is the secret to living mindfully. And he's here today to talk about this. And it's great to have you on. He's calling from England. So Danny, welcome to the show today. It's great to have you on.
Yeah, no, I'm really pleased you're having me.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic. I'm very familiar with the work of Jon Kabat-Zinn. I've done a lot of work with him, and I actually attended his stress reduction clinic at UMass several years ago, which I found to be a remarkable thing. But the first question I have for you, I mean, I love the title, The Art of Breathing. Breathing seems to be so obvious, and yet for more, it is far more difficult than we imagine. Why is it so difficult when we think about that obvious thing? It seems it's such a natural event, and we take it for granted every day, and yet in the essence of concentrating on that, we can really find some sort of peace.
Yeah, I mean, the big problem, as it were, with breathing in the modern world is the breath quite naturally reflects our emotions. And so what happens is if we are kind of anxious or stressed or, any of those kind of disturbing emotions, the body begins to constrain its breathing. We tighten up. Instinctively when we feel stressed, we tighten up. What that does is the lungs are compressed very slightly, and all of the muscles around your lungs and your stomach tense. And this means you breathe less efficiently, and on a very small level, it restricts the amount of oxygen that's in the blood. It's a very subtle process. Yeah,
it makes sense for me. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. And then what happens is the body senses that slight drop in oxygen as stress. It feels slightly more stressed. And therefore, it kind of restricts breathing even more. It becomes slightly shallower. So you end up in this downward spiral. And virtually nobody realizes they are in this downward spiral. So they just become stressed. It's often a very small thing that triggers this response. So people suddenly, quite well-balanced people could quite suddenly tip themselves over into like a panic attack or start to feel quite...
Yeah, I was going to say panic, because you start to get that shortness and you start to hyperventilate even, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. And so in a sense... We have forgotten how to breathe properly. When we get into these situations, we have forgotten how to breathe properly. And what the art of breathing is about is to kind of, using mindfulness, is to learn when that kind of downward spiral begins. It also gives you the tools to reverse the process. And so I hope it is a distillation of the world's simplest and most straightforward meditation and mindfulness techniques, because I've written several mindfulness books in the past, one of which is called Mindfulness, an 8-week plan for finding peace in a frantic world. Mm-hmm. That's sold over 1 million copies now. So it's a big international bestseller. And I realized that those ideas were not actually reaching the maximum number of people, because it was quite a weighty book, 200 and something pages, and I actually wanted to take a lot of those core ideas and just kind of distill them down into a book that is really simple, really straightforward, and hopefully quite beautiful as well.
Yeah, it's very accessible. It's a very quick snippets. It's an easy read. It's an easy. I think what I like about it is it gives you these very nice exercises that you can do to sort of just get yourself back on track. A lot of suggestions about how to cope with certain situations. I find that to be very useful, and it's sort of like a very easy guide, because this topic is the essence of all of mindfulness, and mindfulness in itself is no small task or no small subject either. And so to distill it down to this form, I find to be very useful, because it does provide you with those sort of like band-aids for a situation, almost, if for lack of a better word,
Yes. I mean, it's one of those things. We all think we breathe. We all breathe unconsciously without realizing it. And so sometimes it's very, very good to just take a step back, focus on the breathing, and we quite naturally then begin to relax.
Yeah. I think we live in a world in which we live in now, where there's not a single corner of the planet that doesn't seem to be under some sort of duress. And this, as a result, is when we are in the midst of this, people who especially live in the cities or are going through the hustle and the bustle of getting on the tube and getting on the subway and getting the buses and everything else they do in a very busy world, are sort of overwhelmed by the stimuli. And the stimuli has been exponentially increased over the last 10 years because of the advent of cell phones, and now all of a sudden we have all these things in our hands and we are constantly being interrupted. It's that interrupt-driven kind of outside-induced stress that I think just exacerbates exactly what you're trying to undo, or at least try to remedy.
Yeah. I mean, just it'd be quite interesting, for some of your listeners, just to pay attention to themselves through the day and the breathing. And when their cell phone rings, watch how they react, because I can almost guarantee their stomachs will tighten. Their chest will constrict very slightly. And then there's this kind of sense of stress and anxiety. Who is this calling? Especially if the number hasn't flashed up and they don't recognize it.
Right.
And it's a very small thing. However, if that happens repeatedly through the day, text messages or whatever, it adds to the daily intake of stress.
Oh, completely. It reminds me, like, I had this story, I told this story the other day about when I was in college, say, for example, I would leave my parents' home. I used to hitchhike back then, hitchhike to college, and I would probably call my parents once every 2 or 3 weeks just because I needed money or whatever. They'd throw a check in the mail. But when my own children leave the house and go back to school for the semester, I'm always worried about, did they get there or not? So I want to know within an hour that they got there. I want to send me a text message back. Everything has been amplified to the point where if we don't get that message now, where my father didn't care less, he figured something was wrong, he'd hear from me. 2 weeks would go by without a problem at all. But now an hour goes by without hearing from somebody. We think something's wrong because we haven't got that expected response back, and that just amplifies everything dramatically.
Yeah. I mean, to reflect that, I hitchhiked across America in 1990 when I was about 20, 21, something like that.
Very good, brave of you.
It was great fun. I mean, honestly, me and my friend had a great time. But I wrote to my parents. Once when we were in Canada, once when we eventually washed up somewhere in Mexico, and then somewhere else in Central America, and it was just like maybe once a month I'd write a letter, and that was it.
A good old fashioned paper letter, right?
Absolutely, yeah. It's so I suppose maybe life was just so different then. He didn't expect you.
I think there's a number of things that happen. I think that the fact that there's this sort of this when cell phones first came out, people who had them were people who probably needed them, like, presidents and generals and stuff like that. Yes. When you reduce that down to the 11-year-old going to school and, texting his friends back and forth, whatever, that is now made a whole new conversation that is, has just complicated our lives beyond belief, because we never would have had that conversation prior to that. We never would have had this thing in our face. It's not only just the news stream and the texts and the stuff like that are coming through. It's the presence of why haven't the other person contacted me, when that assumption was never in our midst before.
Absolutely. And of course, wall-to-wall television and websites, news websites, you automatically think the world is falling apart. Nothing's actually changed. The world is probably a far better place than it was 20 years ago and 50 years ago and 100 years ago. But it doesn't seem that way, because every time you go to a news website, there's, a shooting or a plane crash or a war or whatever, So we got such a skewed view of the world that, again, it just ramps up the stress, ramps up the kind of low-level unhappiness that we're all feeling, because we think everything is falling apart. And actually, it's not falling apart.
No, and that you raise a really good point, because, you think about it, even 10 years ago, a lot of the things that we see that we think of as bad now have always been happening. I think a lot of black people have always been shot by police. There's always been a problem there.
Yes.
And yet, now that we can videotape them with our phones, it becomes more prevalent. That all of these things become more prevalent because we have the accessibility to be there with a phone to record it. So there's a constant churn of not man-made news, natural news that happens that we never would have been aware of before.
No, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, you just look at the progress that's been made, against all forms of disease. The world is a far less violent place than it's ever been.
But you'd never get that impression reading the news. You would
no,
never get that.
Not.
It's really frightening. So that's why your approach to mindfulness and the idea of backing away from all that is critical right now, more so than ever. It's actually an antidote to what we're facing with in some ways, because this is the necessary salve, so to speak. This is the necessary salve for our souls, is to allow ourselves this time to back away, put that thing down, and just devote yourself to some normalcy. I think that's a very difficult, but there's a problem with that in the sense that because they are addictive in some cases, people become immersed in this realm and have a hard time separating themselves from that. I mean, I'm sure you've seen people trying to meditate with their phone next to them. It's like, why bother?
Yeah, well, I'm in a sense guilty of that, in that I use a timer app on my phone.
That's different. That's different than picking it up when a phone call rings or whatever. If you're setting a timer, that's sort of that's an aid in that regard to keep you on track for your good habit.
Yeah, that's the way I look at it. I mean, I always switch off the data connection and the phone function and just use it as a timer. So they are very useful things. In fact, there are actually about 20 different things rolled into one. So, I love them, but I'm very, very aware of their downside. And what I've actually started doing in my own life is come 5 o'clock in the evening and at weekends, I just switch off the data connection.
Oh, interesting. Good idea. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because they are so addictive that you just cannot help. If there's a moment of quiet or calm, you just pick it up because you think, I'm bored. Mm-hmm. So you pick up your phone and you start looking, and then you come across something, and then you're just sucked into this world. And actually, I think it's the worst thing to do, because we actually need time to just relax, let our minds wander, and also be bored. People really underestimate the creative value of being bored, I think.
Being bored is a catalyst for creativity in some ways, because it forces you to rethink why you're bored, what are you doing. But I think our default mechanism right now is when we're bored, we just pick up the phone and see what scandal just happened, and we are in that time where that is incredibly rich with information. I mean, and I think that what your idea is spot on with regard to putting them down, but the challenge comes from how.
Yes.
The challenge comes from how, but I think that your approach in your book is it raises the awareness of the value of sort of taking a deep breath, putting down the phone, turning it off, and just being with yourself alone. And that boredom is a thing which I find to be, it can be frustrating. I'm a very actively minded person, so I always want to be doing things. I'm always sort of in my head doing. But when I'm bored, I find that I do something I normally wouldn't do. I try to do new things, which then expands your consciousness in some ways and expands your range of knowledge in new ways. Yeah. And so there's a value to it. The hard part comes from the breathing, as you mentioned, and I'm wondering why it seems so hard. Why is letting go? it seems so easy. How many times you've been to somebody said, "Oh, just let it go," and you say, "Well, it's easy for you to say. It's not that easy to let things go." Why do you think that is?
That's a really good question. I mean, we all, first of all, we are all on a hair trigger. We just all ready to fly off the handle because there's just this continuous low-level stress in the background, low-level anxiety. And I think that's a part of it. And I think that also we kind of feel we have to punish ourselves all of the time, punish ourselves for not maximizing every opportunity, for not working hard enough, for not being kind enough, for not being good enough. And that is tremendously corrosive for the soul. Guilt, all of these things, we're just punishing ourselves all of the time. And combine that with a hair trigger. So we're constantly responding rather than reacting.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the subjects that you're talking about are a direct result of, I have to say, social media. Because if we're seeing things out there that other people are doing, that imposes guilt on us, saying, "I'm not doing enough. I should be doing more. How do I get around this?" These are real problems. I understand this completely. Because I find myself in this. Actually, matter of fact, I've tried to stay off social media, and just as a result of that, because I see, it's not just people publishing books or accomplishing things or getting promotions or whatever, or having babies or whatever they're doing. It's also about, what am I not doing that I should be doing? Why? It's almost as if the bar has been raised so high we don't have any forgiveness for ourselves for who we are. We have this certain basic talents that we inherited, or we have polished in our lifetime, and all of a sudden that's not good enough. Why is that?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's just this basic fault in modern Western culture. I mean, I'm not one of these people who just idolizes Eastern culture or more simple cultures and kind of criticize our own. But I think that the consumer society that has kind of taken root over the past few decades is just so corrosive. It makes us dissatisfied. I mean, the fundamental driving force, really, of kind of consumerism and capitalism is dissatisfaction. Without a dissatisfied population, you are not going to sell them more products year after year after year.
Right.
And people, on one level, the consumer society, materialism, has given us an amazing standard of living compared to even 50 years ago. And that, this is a huge accomplishment. But the downside is that driving force of dissatisfaction. We have to tackle that. If we don't tackle it, it is going to destroy our society.
Right. For all the benefit we get, we actually lose it all by that sense of dissatisfaction. So, and that's why there's always this newer, faster, cheaper, smaller kind of mentality that happens. And you buy anybody who buys a computer these days, within 6 months, there's a new one. They're replacing it. Then you know that it's faster, better, cheaper, smaller. All that. So that keeps us in a constant swirl of feeling a sense of inadequacy. And then we're not in our present moment saying, well, I should be happy with what I have. Just be happy with what I've got. Not feel the pressure of this outside force.
Absolutely. And, it's not just computers. It's absolutely everything. And the risk of sounding like some grumpy old man, it's everything. Clothes are designed to be worn only a few times and then thrown away. I mean, cars are the only things that seem to have become, last longer, to be honest.
That's just because they cost so much. You can't afford to turn them over that frequently.
Yeah, well, that's probably true as well.
Yeah. I mean, it is a state, though, that and all of these things that we're mentioning, these are sort of all symptoms of a society that is fractured in some ways, and a species that is fractured. And the way to address that is through the art of breathing, I believe firmly. I think that you're spot on when it comes to the antidote to these times. It really does come down to that, because I think people would not even recognize where they lived or what's around them because they're so inundated with the outside stimuli that is drawing them in. They don't even recognize where they are, who they're with sometimes. I think that goes that far.
Yeah. I mean, a wonderful antidote to all of this hassle and stress is, at certain points through the day, 3 or 4 times, just stop, close your eyes, and spend a few moments focusing on the sensations of breathing. And that is incredibly relaxing. And, what is even more ideal is, spend 10 or 20 minutes a day just meditating, just focusing on the breath. And, it works in a very, very simple way, in that if you just take a few deep breaths, you reverse that process that I described earlier, where you become a little bit stressed, your body tightens, the oxygen levels in the blood go down, which the brain senses as stress. It throws that process into reverse. So by taking a few breaths, you reoxygenate the blood, you relax, and your body becomes flooded with oxygen, and you relax a little bit more. So within a few breaths, you can become an awful lot calmer. And, if you have the time and can spend 10 minutes, 20 minutes meditating on the breath, you just come back incredibly calm and relaxed and in control of your life. And these are very, very simple techniques you can do pretty much anywhere.
Why do you think it's so hard for people to get their head around it? I mean, I know we have all these excuses. We come up with 1,000 excuses, but we really shouldn't. We should be able to do this with pretty much ease.
People, I think, deep down feel as if they're wasting time when they meditate. And even if they just close their eyes for 20 or 30 seconds just to focus on the breath, they feel as if they're kind of cheating. There's always something more important to be doing. They should be concentrating on the email. They should be concentrating on the messages they've received, or clinching some crucial deal, or this, that, and the other. And actually, what's happening is they're just chasing their own tails. They are. But it's feel deep down, you feel as if you're accomplishing something if you are chasing your own tail, when of course in reality you're not. You should actually break the day up into smaller parts, interspersed with just a few moments of focusing on the breath.
What do you think is it that caused this sort of this shift in our priorities? Why are we driven by this this desire for all the things you mentioned? What is it? Why are we so empty, do you think?
Good question. I mean, I think that in a way we've been sold a lie for understandable reasons. We feel that if we get the latest consumer products, then somehow we're going to feel more accomplished as human beings. And of course, that's completely wrong. We won't. All of the evidence shows that if you buy, say, a wonderful new phone or car or whatever it is, very quickly you're going to start becoming dissatisfied again. But deep down we feel if we just buy one more thing, if we just go shopping, if we buy that new car or that new house or whatever, then life will be complete. And of course it's not. It's just
not,
an endless
treadmill. It's like you go through this sort of this little routine in your head saying, well, this will be the last thing I'll buy for a year. And then, a week goes by and you're like looking for something new again.
Absolutely. Yeah. And
there's an addictive quality to that. I think that's sort of a habitual addictive quality that goes with that.
It's true. And the interesting thing is how addictions work. I mean, the most powerful addictions of all are essentially random. It's why slot machines and gambling is so addictive, because if you get an unexpected reward at random intervals, that gives your brain a little shot of dopamine, which stimulates the reward centers. And if it's unexpected, it's even more powerful. And that's the way it works. That's why we get addicted to the most bizarre things.
Like Pavlov's dogs here, we are.
Yep, absolutely. Which is why, if you watch people when they receive a message on their phone, first of all, you get the stress, and then you get this little reward. And then it's just a process of addiction.
Well, it's the level of the interruption that is become sort of mundane, for lack of a better word. I mean, if you were somebody of great importance and you were out to lunch, say you're a CEO and you got a message that your stock just dropped 100 points, or you would probably need to respond to that. But if you're out to lunch with a bunch of friends and somebody tells you to get a quart of milk, or so-and-so did something to me, there's a level of importance that requires your attention, and there's a level of importance that does not require your attention. But the phone makes that urgency immediate.
Yeah, absolutely. And you say about CEOs might need all this constant interruption, but there's quite a few companies out there that will run an awful lot more effectively and efficiently if the boss is on holiday.
Oh, of course they do. I'm the first to agree with you there. I can totally get that.
Yeah.
But you know what I'm saying? It's the level of urgency that's there, that's built in, and now, of course, it's trickling down to younger and younger generations. It concerns me because I'm afraid that it's going to become the de facto method for us interrelating, and I think that there's a lot of other things that go along with this, and I'm sort of going off on an offshoot here, but the idea of connection with human beings is going to become less, and so the idea of breathing allows us to reconnect back to that sort of very primal state, whereby, oh, so and so, there's a friend of mine across the room there. He may have his head in a phone, but I have to appreciate him now or her now because this is who I am. So we lose that sense of basic primal tribalism that's part of us.
Yeah, but I think these things tend to go full circle. I mean, I think the reason why there's been a tremendous increase in interest in mindfulness and breathing and all the rest of it over the past few years is in response to that always-on society. People instinctivly rebel against it, even if they're not fully conscious of it. They're looking for something else, and mindfulness gives them that.
They're dissatisfied with the current state, in other words, their status quo. So they are looking. You think that people are thirsty for more time out.
Yeah, absolutely. And, once they get a little taste of it, they find it difficult to go back.
They sort of become addicted to that.
Exactly. That's it. I'm selling a different drug.
Right. You've got to shift your shift your addictions. Yeah. Well, I've always read and I've been a strong proponent that it takes about 3 weeks to establish a habit, and I think once you establish a habit, then you miss that habit. But one of your chapters in your book says, I forget which one it was. I think something about curiosity. Curiosity is the what is it? The word I want. There was something. Curiosity kills habits. Curiosity kills habits. Because if we have a habit that's well established, curiosity would drive us away from that habit. Is that your point?
Absolutely, yes. Mm-hmm. And breaking habits is actually fundamental to mindfulness because we all spend somewhere between 40 to 80% of our time performing some habit. Now, that is fine if you're in control of the habit. For example, most of the actions that we do when driving are purely habitual. But there's plenty of other things that aren't habitual, and they just waste huge amounts of time, like endlessly checking you've locked the front door.
Oh, that's sort of like an obsessive compulsive thing, sort of thing. Yeah.
Well, we all have that now. I mean, it's in fact the normal level of kind of anxiety that we all experience on a day-to-day level would be considered clinical in the 1950s, as in you would require treatment in the 1950s.
Oh, wow, that's really interesting. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And
yet now it's considered normal.
Yeah, and it just shows because it's built up over the years and over the decades. We just consider it entirely normal, and actually, we are always on. Our foot is always pressed down hard on the accelerator.
Yeah, that's really something. I'll tell you, that's an interesting commentary. We're talking today with Danny Penman. He's the author of a book called The Art of Breathing, The Secret to Living Mindfully. And we're going to take a quick break here. We'll be back in a few minutes. While we're taking a break, if you want to, swing on by his website, Frantic World. How appropriate that name is. FranticWorld.com is his website, and you can see and look for his work there. And we'll be back in a few minutes to continue our conversation about the art of breathing. So hang in there, folks. We'll be right back. Okay, welcome back to Turning of the Wheel. My guest today is Danny Penman. He's the author of a book called The Art of Breathing, and we're talking about sort of the ability of us all, and I'm first to admit I'm part of this, of us all to avoid distraction. We are so driven. We are a distraction-driven society, driven largely by this use of cell phones and having this instant access. But in that, we also lose a large part of what it means to be human, and as a direct physiological result of us being in this heightened state of anxiety, which does not allow our bodies to focus the way they should be. We don't get enough oxygen in our blood the way we need to. Oxygen is a necessary component to keep all of our organs working properly and ourselves alert and stuff. And so what Danny's book is really talking about is the art of breathing. And it sounds like an odd thing because we all are all breathing. If we're all listening to this podcast right now, we're all breathing. But can we honestly take the time to put things down and listen to our breath? And that is a interesting concept. Now, what are some of the historical precedents to this? I mean, you've been very well versed in mindfulness. You obviously know Jon Kabat-Zinn, who's very well known in this regard. Does this spring from a different society or culture that has brought this to our attention, or is there some sort of, historical pathway backwards from this to where we are now?
Well, mindfulness itself and meditation in general originated at least 2,500 years ago. It was first written down, as it were, or known to be practiced by the Buddha, but it was present, right across the ancient world. The ancient Greek philosophers, and then later on the Roman philosophers practiced mindfulness in its various forms and various breathing meditations. And it's present in all religions, and also early atheists would practice these techniques. It's not an entirely religious practice at all.
Right.
And it was very common in Christianity until the late Middle Ages, but it just fell out of use, really. I mean, in the case of the UK, it was when we call it the dissolution of the monasteries. It's when Henry VIII and people of that ilk essentially seized the monasteries and burnt down the libraries. They were the Taliban of the day,
Right, yeah.
And so they actually destroyed all of that ancient knowledge. But it was quite common right across Europe. Obviously, went across to America, but it just kind of died out, really, and it was rediscovered. Firstly, by American servicemen who were stationed in the Far East, when Japan was beaten in the Second World War, and later on in Korea, all of those servicemen, when they came back, some of them had learnt these techniques. And they were in the Beat generation, as they became known. They were the first to practice Zen Buddhist meditation.
Right.
And then there was another wave in the 70s when a lot of the hippies went out to India and brought these techniques back. And then Jon Kabat-Zinn in the UMass Medical Center, he came across these techniques and he decided that they would be very, very useful for helping people cope with chronic pain. So he devised a program called mindfulness-based stress reduction. And he found it was very, very effective. And he did some clinical trials and found that, it demonstrably worked. And then there was another big step forward. I think it was in the late 90s, mid to late 90s, when psychiatrists, notably Professor Mark Williams at Oxford University in the UK, realised that this could possibly be a treatment for depression, a long-term maintenance treatment for depression. So Mark and some of his colleagues turned it into a treatment known as mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. So essentially that's a fusion between cognitive behavioral therapy and mindfulness techniques. And it proved to be highly effective for the worst forms of depression. And a great many clinical trials have now shown that NBCT, is at least as good as drugs or counselling for the worst forms of depression. And I worked with Mark to take his ideas to a wider audience, and that became our book, Mindfulness, which is the bestseller, as it were.
Yeah. It's a fascinating, I think also, as I told you, I had been to the Jon Kabat stress reduction clinic 3 times.
Yeah.
I had a lot of good things going on in my life, but it was interesting because I learned of it there, even though I'd had earlier knowledge of the idea of mindfulness, but I also learned that this was a form of And part of the study that John Kabat-Zinn found out as a result of doing this was the lowering in the incidence of breast cancer for women because of the incidence of stress. So using mindfulness as a stress reduction technique became effective in eliminating diseases. And he did a very in-depth study about this, and this is the conclusion he came to. And it was a remarkable situation there to go through. And I learned so much in the short time that I had been there that it's really turned my world around dramatically in ways that allowed me to cope with situations much differently. So there's a direct correlation between all the things that you're saying and the practice of breathing. And it's just amazing. But, I think what happens is many people find excuses or have that interrupt-driven daily structure that because it's interrupt-driven, they put off this, they say, I just can't sit still that long. And you're not talking a long period of time, right? You're talking, you can go anywhere from 3 to 20 minutes. You don't have to be, doesn't have to be an hour of sitting still looking at your navel. It can be a short time just to get that burst of, to remove that edge that's there.
Yeah, absolutely. But they always say that the most difficult part of yoga is first to move onto the yoga mat. And it's same is true with mindfulness. The practice itself is very, very simple and straightforward. But the most difficult thing is actually beginning.
Yeah.
You can always find a reason not to do it. And that's why you really need to kind of build it into your daily life. Otherwise, it's just going to get squeezed out by other things.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Because I think you're right. That's the whole procrastination mentality of, well, I'll try it tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll start, and then something else comes along tomorrow. And it depends upon the degree of what we call an emergency. A flat tire or somebody stuck in a situation where they can't get out is much different than saying, a child who wants a glass of milk or whatever. You have to address them. That may not be a very good example, but the idea is that you have to address them with a level of priority. And I think that what happens is that we've changed that priority in some ways because we make it, and perhaps our society has made it more much easier for us to find that excuse.
Yes, no, I think that's right. Is that because we live in an always-on society, everything is an emergency. We live life on maximum adrenaline, really, maximum stress levels, and that drives everything. The way we look at the world. Because the world is often a reflection of ourselves, and if we are stressed, the whole world looks like a very stressful place. Yeah. Whereas if you are relaxed, the world looks like a far more relaxed place. You can spot the good more easily. You can spot beauty more easily.
Yeah, it's interesting.
I mean, the trick is obviously to go from that kind of hyper-aroused state to something that's a little more chilled out.
Mm-hmm. I have found in my own personal practice that sometimes I do better if I have a sort of a mantra in the back of my head because that allows me to double focus, I guess, because I have that sort of, even if it's just a quiet mental verbal cue that I go in my head, it allows me to sort of remove everything else. Oftentimes I find myself early in the morning, 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning, waking up and then worrying needlessly about a constant litany of things I have to worry about, whether my dog needs medicine or my child needs this, whatever. We can all find something to worry about all day long. But what I've found myself doing lately is shifting into a mode where I try to get into that state where I start to count or just count my breaths, even if it's just quietly to myself. I find that it does interject, because you can't do two things at once. I mean, you may think you can, but when you're talking to yourself or whatever, trying to keep yourself focused on your breath, that's all you really can do. So it does sort of force it, and maybe it's not the appropriate way to do it by counting, but whatever works, I think, is worthwhile.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have my own personal, you could call them mantras in a way. When I feel stress building, maybe I feel a little bit anxious for whatever reason, and I'll just acknowledge that emotion and say to myself, anxious thoughts, or stressful thoughts. And it's funny, the act of recognizing those emotions and, just naming them makes them dissolve. It's really quite a strange and therapeutic process. Just acknowledging the existence of those emotions in my body helps them to just dissolve.
Dissolve is the key word
Yeah.
there. Yeah, you want them to
Yeah.
dissolve like a sugar cube in a cup of tea.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Well, the thing is, all emotions are, well, they have two elements to them. One is they are a message, and they're also a messenger. The thing is, if you turn away the messenger, it is so persistent. It is just going to come back and come back and come back. Whereas if you just acknowledge the message, then the messenger has done his job and it just quietly wanders off.
Mm-hmm. And that's a different part of it altogether. And it just the wandering off is the desired goal. We have to try to get
exactly.
there.
Yeah,
and that's the hard part to do that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it is part of a program. It's as I said, that's like my own personal little mantra, and I find it highly effective. But it's highly effective because I practice mindfulness meditation as well, so that I can recognize destructive thoughts and emotions, early on in the cycle.
So if you begin on a cycle of destructive or a caustic thought or a worry, for example, you address that by just shifting into a mode of meditation to sort of offset that, right?
Yeah. Just to acknowledge the existence of that emotion in my body and my mind, and it's that acknowledgement, that ensures that the messenger has delivered its message, and it just goes away.
By acknowledging the elephant in the room, so to speak, you say, okay, this is here, and I'm worrying about this, and that's okay to worry about it, I guess, and then you just move on from there.
Yeah. Absolutely, because if you try and suppress it, it just keeps on coming back, and it comes back stronger.
Yeah, it does. You're right. It's sort of like that is an OCD thing in itself, because you just sort of get obsessed about the thoughts that you're thinking. You can't turn it off. And the best thing to do is to shift gears in some sort. I know that when I was training my dog, when he was younger, he would be chewing on something, and I got a soda can. I put some coins in the soda can, then taped the top of it over. Every time I saw him chewing something, I would shake the can. His attention would be drawn away, and he would stop doing it. And it was so sort of like I always use that technique called shaking the can. And I try to do that with myself. If I find myself going down a negative journey, I try to shake the can to get myself out of that. And sometimes that requires that you do something like stepping outside or meditating, which is the perfect.
Yeah. It's just about shifting mental gears. That's what mindfulness really gives you.
Easier said than done sometimes, as we all know.
Well, yeah. I mean, the mind is, by its very nature, it tends to chase its own tail.
It's the monkey mind. It's the monkey mind.
It is indeed.
Yeah. Have you ever thought, or I'm sure you have, I noticed that you have children. Do you think that getting children started on this at a young age would be a wise thing to do? Do you think they would be able to do that?
Yes. Or rather, yes and no. I don't think it's particularly beneficial to teach very young children, say, I don't know, under 10 or 12, meditation practices as such. But I think certainly as teenagers, before they become too rebellious and refuse to learn from you.
Right. But that's the fine line to find out.
Yeah, well, exactly. However, what I do, I've got a 6-year-old daughter, and what I try to do is teach her some of the things that or elements of mindfulness, such as paying attention. I mean, children naturally pay attention anyway, but really kind of try to guide her attention, harness her curiosity, that kind of thing. And, when she's feeling a little stressed, as she was before, there's just like a little squabble in the playground, and she was obviously a bit distressed by this. So it's really a question of, reassuring her that these powerful emotions she was feeling are, it's entirely normal, and, they pass, and all the rest of it. So it's a way of teaching her the things that she would learn from mindfulness itself. And, when she's a little older, maybe 9, 10 years old, I'll start teaching her, basic breathing exercises, that kind of thing.
Right. And I think the way to do that would be, because, children, I think, are probably faced with, their own fears and uncertainties and doubts that they have when they go to the playground or whatever, and somebody makes fun of them. That would be the time to bring up the meditation and say, this is how you counteract that. Becomes your... The antidote to the negativity that you're feeling if it happens to you. And in those times, it would be very useful. My mother, when I was a kid, would always say, before I was going to the doctor, she would say, she would say, just say a simple phrase to yourself, which is kind of like a mantra in some ways, and just repeating it over and over again. It probably did relieve some stress at some level. And, of course, prayer in its ultimate sense is a form of meditation, as you mentioned earlier. It is there in that same pocket.
Yeah. I mean, it is certainly certain forms of prayer is, yes, exactly what it is. I mean, I try to distinguish between the two because
right, it is important. I think you're right.
Yeah, and I also think it's important to realize that mindfulness itself is secular,
right?
But it has been used by religious people and by religions to kind of calm the mind, to see clearly, that kind of thing. So I think it's a good kind of initiator, as it were, preparing the mind and body for prayer, but it's not a prayer itself.
Right. Whoever's responsible for this grand design we call human beings, it seems so. This exercise seems so basic and so simple and so readily available to us. It's right in our bodies without having to leave anywhere, and yet it is one of the most hard. It's a very difficult thing to attain, and I guess that's just the nature of our species and the way our minds are made up.
Well, absolutely, because if you look back at the early texts, from 2,500 years ago, they had exactly the same problems meditating as we do today.
They did. They were distracted easily back then.
Absolutely. And so,
things have not changed.
all of these things we criticize ourselves for are essentially they're human. It makes us human.
It's the human condition. So we came with this built-in. This is our software. We've just got it. We're stuck with it. We can't get away from it. That's interesting. That's an interesting thing to know that. I would have thought that back in the day they would have had out tending the sheep or knitting a sweater or cutting fire or whatever. I think you'd think that they would be mindful. They would be occupied, and that would keep them busy. And that's just our cell phones are doing. But I imagine that they probably had their same worries back then.
Yeah, I mean, they were probably thinking, worrying about wolves taking the sheep. They were probably thinking about the shepherdess in the valley next door or whatever. Right. All the same.
Things have not changed, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's funny. Have you thought about, what's the biggest challenge you find when people come to you or they find that they say, well, I'm going to do this. And they say, this is it. I'm drawing a line in the sand. From now I'm going to meditate. What do you find to be their biggest downfall or the biggest obstacle?
It depends very much on the person. Most people have a problem with commitment in that they will start day one with all enthusiasm, and they, by the time day 2 or 3, they keep on running into the same problems that they had on the first day. So they get disillusioned with it. They will criticize themselves for their minds wandering, for their inability to sit still. They want perfection. And the most difficult skill, or most difficult thing to do is to accept actually, minds wander. The human mind wanders. It's what it is designed to do. So in that moment when you realize that your mind has wandered off for the 1,000th time during a meditation, that moment itself is a moment of mindfulness. It's a moment of realization, and that is what mindfulness is.
Recognizing that you've wandered.
Yes.
And not being hard on yourself for that, but just bringing yourself back to the center, right?
Yes.
Bring yourself back to the center. Yeah. It's the idea of living in the moment rather than for the moment, I guess is what it is, right?
Absolutely. That's exactly what it is. And people find that very difficult. It's a very difficult thing to accept. And you just kind of have to accept it, really. It is part of the process. And the way I reassure people is look at the evidence. The evidence for the benefits of mindfulness are absolutely overwhelming. Wow. There are countless clinical trials now that have shown mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, for example, is at least as good as drugs or counseling for the worst forms of depression. Brilliant for anxiety and stress too. And a recent clinical trial at Cambridge University in the UK has shown that our book Mindfulness is highly effective in helping people cope with depression and anxiety and stress. So just doing the program in the book itself, works wonders. And it's being used to across our health and education systems now in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
Because
to great effect. Yeah, you've got an interesting situation in the United Kingdom. I noticed recently there was a minister of loneliness was appointed, which I thought was remarkable, because I think that's so appropriate for people to for a government to be mindful of that, to put the words together, because of the fact that this loneliness is a direct result of not being fully present and being wrapped up in this distracting thing that makes you feel as if you're inadequate and therefore alone.
Yeah. Something like 130 or 140 of our MPs, lawmakers, have now taken up meditation. That's a quarter of our legislature.
That's great.
Well, I think it will make a difference in the long run.
Oh, I think it will too. I think it's going to be a very slow turn, but the simple fact that they are acknowledging and doing it, I think it speaks volumes. I mean, if they started off our Congress with 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes of silent meditation, I think they'd probably get a lot more done, and there'd be much less to worry about. Instead, we have just the exact opposite of that. So we really, if ever there was a call for mindfulness, I think we are in the midst of the most heightened time. And that's just the way it looks to me now. But I mean, in order for us, so your comment earlier about sort of how the pendulum swings, and we probably will reach a point where we can no longer stand the barrage of insanity and distraction, and we will naturally default to the opposite, and think that would be the slow turn back.
Yeah, I think it's almost inevitable. People essentially burn out, and then they look for an alternative, and mindfulness is that alternative.
Right, and it doesn't require a prescription, doesn't require a doctor's visit. It just requires taking the initiative on your own to try to repair yourself. This is a self-healing tool, if nothing else. This is a self-healing tool, and it's interesting. And I think it's important to also mention the fact, and I'm sure you're aware of this, that we don't have to sit still to do this. We can also do mindfulness as a walking meditation. Perhaps maybe you would be more distracted by what's going on around the world if you're out walking down the street, but you can do it in other forms, right? I mean, you don't have to sit still to do this.
Absolutely.
And how would that happen? How would someone address that sort of, if they chose to be more active and move as a form of meditation?
Well, one of my favorite techniques, if I'm starting to feel a little bit stressed, or maybe I'm trying to get to a meeting and everything seems to be going against me, is actually to do a walking meditation. And so I begin to pay attention to the way my feet feel as they touch the floor. And I focus on the breath and, all of the sounds that surround me and the smells in the air. So it's that process of grounding that's, inherently mindful. And that itself is incredibly therapeutic. Very, very calming.
It's really funny. I'm an avid walker. I walk about 4 miles a day, just as a part of my daily routine. And one day I was walking around on my routine. I had a stone in my shoe, a little pebble in my shoe, which could be incredibly annoying if you've ever done this. And yet, rather than remove that pebble, I kept it in there the whole time while I was walking. I could have stopped easily and just taken my shoe off and gotten rid of it, but I kept it in there because it sort of focused me in an odd way, on what I was doing. I says, wow, this is really a pain in the neck to have this stone in my shoe, but I'm going to keep it there. And it sort of has an element of mindfulness to it, in a sort of a Zen kind of practice, because I was forcing me to focus on the pebble and maybe nothing else.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, anything that focuses the mind, can be an aid to mindfulness.
Right.
You can, one of my other favorite techniques is a chocolate meditation, where you mindfully eat a bar of chocolate. And you'd be astounded how many different flavors there are in good chocolate. I mean, there is something like 300 different flavors in chocolate, and just closing your eyes and focusing on the way it melts on the tongue, and all of the way you get this cascade of different flavors flowing over you. It's really quite extraordinary.
It really is fun. I can see that totally. I mean, it's talk about an addiction in a way. I mean, it's an amazing discovery. Well, I was in the stress reduction class at UMass, one of the things they had us do is take a raisin, a single raisin, and put it in our mouth and eat it incredibly slowly. And just to get the text, go through the whole step. What does it feel like? What's it smell like? What is the texture? And just one single raisin. And we did it for about 5 minutes, and it was pretty revealing how much detail I was able to derive about a simple single raisin as a result. But it did do the exact same thing that the pebble did for me. It sort of forced me to shift my attention away from the outside world. I was focused only on the raisin, and as a result, it supplanted that nervous energy chatter that goes through my head all the time.
Yeah. I mean, you can apply these techniques to absolutely anything. If you're drinking a cup of tea or coffee, again, do it mindfully. All the different flavors and tastes and the, textures. I mean, coffee and tea, they're totally different textures to each other and to water. It's absolutely anything at all. And, another technique I love doing is going to my local park, sitting on a bench, closing my eyes and just focusing on all of the sounds that surround me. It's like you might hear a train in the distance, an aeroplane, cars, automobiles, children playing. The world is a noisy place.
Yeah, and it's the more you submerge yourself in a very noisy place, the harder it is. But then again, the more reward is there, I think, as well.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, it's fascinating. My guest today has been Danny Penman. He's the author of a book called The Art of Breathing. He's also the author of a book called Mindfulness, which he released. It's an international bestseller. This book in particular is a very, very good introduction because it's so accessible. There's a lot of memory cues in here. Simple exercises you can take. It's extremely accessible. I encourage people to look into the idea of this because of that reason. This takes something that could conceivably be very complicated, which it isn't complicated. It's very simple in many ways. But getting to that point requires some aid. And I think your book does that very well by giving you these memory cues, sort of these little like flashcards almost that say, stop, do this, do this, do this, do that. And it does get you to that spot much more quickly than trying to do it on your own. I think this serves a very valuable function in that regard. And so his Danny's website is called Frantic World, which is a perfect name for your what you're trying to address by mindfulness meditation, and it certainly makes a lot of sense. Anything you'd like to say in closing, Danny, about what we're talking about?
Yeah, it'd be great if anybody wants to try these techniques, just to pay a visit to my website. There's loads of meditations they can download for free. Just have a look around, download some meditations, have a look at the evidence, because this is all, scientifically it's bulletproof now. Just have a look around.
They've done the data. They know. They have all the empirical data is there that says this is the way to go. Yeah. That's incredible. Yeah. Again, The Art of Breathing by The Secret to Living Mindfully by Danny Penman. Fantastic book. A nice little book that's going to be very accessible to all to get to and learn this practice because it will save your soul and your sanity at the same time. It'll be well worth it in the long run. Danny, thank you so much for coming on today. I really appreciate your comments and your talk about this wonderful technique.
Brilliant. Thanks for inviting me on. It's been I love these kinds of programs, just sitting there chatting away.
Chatting away, that's it.
Yes.
Oh, very good. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Good.
You've been listening to Turning of the Wheel with your host, Chris Flisher. To schedule a reading with me or to order artwork, you may visit my website at www.turningofthewheel.com. That's www.turningofthewheel.com. Or you can call me at 978-393-1036. Thank you. And as always, be open to possibilities.